A very warm welcome to all of you. In today's lecture, we are going to cover transnationalism in migration studies. In fact, this is a very important topic, and this is something that we'll cover in 2 consecutive lectures, right? And the main reading for this is a paper by Peggy Levitt and Nadia Jaworski, right? So, in the early 90s, there was a transnational turn in migration studies. So, what do we mean by the transnational turn? So, we have scholars who realize that international migration extended beyond the boundaries of the nation state, right? Migration happens beyond the boundary of the nation state, and migrants maintain various kinds of ties to their homeland. And while they maintain their ties to the homeland, they are also incorporated in destination countries that have received them. So, increasingly what we find is that social life takes place across the border. Even as the political and cultural importance of nation states and boundaries is very strong, you have a lot of social, political, cultural, economic life that is taking place beyond the borders, right? So then, therefore, transnational migration studies has emerged to understand these multiple spaces that migrants traverse simultaneously, right? And it's not surprising that it's an increasingly interdisciplinary field. We need to look at various disciplines to be able to understand transnationalism in migration studies. And scholars around the world are trying to seek, describe, analyze all of these new dynamics, invent new methodological tools to study these dynamics. So, in this seminal paper by Peggy Levitt and Nadia Jaworski, we are going to cover several things. So, the first thing that we are going to do is, based on this paper, we will see the various ways in which scholars have conceptualized transnationalism in migration studies, right? What are the different ways in which scholars define transnationalism? How is it that we approach transnational migration, both conceptually and from the point of view of then doing research? Right. The second thing that we are going to do is, as in the flavor of this course, we will see what is known about migrant transnationalism across various disciplines or arenas. So, we look at economics, we look at politics, we look at the social, the cultural and the religious. So, this is to give you a broad sense, a broad flavor of how transnationalism is viewed in various disciplines, what kind of scholarship there has been, and what is the body of knowledge about transnationalism in each discipline, of course with relation to migration studies. And then finally, very briefly, we are going to study the methodological implications of transnationalism in the study of international migration. So, we come to the first part of the paper and of the topic of transnational migration. We're talking really about the transnational turn in migration studies, right, which occurred somewhere in the 1990s. And so what were the theoretical developments, what have been the debates? Let's just sort of go through them briefly, right? But before we begin, very simply, what do we mean by a transnational optic? Very simply put, a transnational optic is that it shows that migrants are simultaneously embedded in multiple sites, right? So, when migrants are simultaneously embedded in multiple sites, that is one way of looking at transnationalism. Now, historically in sociology, assimilation theory has been very powerful and dominant. And assimilation theory argues that over time, most migrants achieve socio-economic parity with the native born, right? So then over time, the idea is that migrants assimilate into host society. But of course, there is an understanding that ethnicity matters, race matters, and of course, both native borns as well as migrants change along the way. So therefore, then, you had the development of the segmented assimilation theory, right? What is the segmented assimilation theory? The segmented assimilation theory suggests that there might be various several possible trajectories for migrants on their route to incorporation. So while they become a part of the mainstream society, which typically ends up being ethnic white societies, so remaining ethnic or becoming a part of the underclass or experiencing downward mobility are all very, very distinct possibilities, right? So then in short, what the segmented assimilation theory says is, okay, assimilation is not universal and assimilation is segmented, right? So one thing about the segmented assimilation theory and the assimilation theory is that both perspectives are rooted in sociological theories, and both perspectives are rooted in the discipline of sociology, and they acknowledge that the pattern of assimilation, acculturation, integration varies, right? It can vary from migrant to migrant, community to community, and it varies because of a host of factors. One thing could be the country from where the migrants are coming from, what has been the context of their departure. It could also vary due to immigrant characteristics. It could vary due to the possibility of enclaves among immigrants at destination. And of course, you know, it could vary due to the possibilities of the political, social, economic context of both the sending and receiving communities, right? So therefore, fundamentally, migration and assimilation are not one-way streets, and the assimilation theories do understand that. So now what we have is, during the 1990s, transnational migration scholars added a third perspective to these conversations, right? And they basically fundamentally argue that some migrants continue to be active in their homeland, and at the same time as they become part of destination societies, a part of societies that have received them, right? So, so when you employ a transnational optic, scholars have argued, scholars have described how migrants and their descendants, how they participate in familial, social, economic, religious, political and cultural processes that extend across the borders while they become parts of the places where they settle, right? So therefore, they see transnational migration everywhere. Now, the minute you incorporate simultaneity, right, and the minute you incorporate embeddedness in multiple societies, then you're also sort of you know, opening up the possibilities to see transnational migration everywhere. And but however, you know, the truth of the matter is that the range and scope of migrants' transnational possibilities really differ a lot, right? So when the transnational turn happened in migration studies, it was very celebratory, right? And you know, there was a perspective that migrants could overpower their poverty, they could overpower their powerlessness to which they were relegated, right? But then there were other scholars who, you know, while they acknowledge the importance of migrant agency, acknowledge the importance of transnational ties, they also, you know, sort of really were a little more critical about the structural nature of this, right? And of course, you know, the whole element of generation is very critical here. And and they argued that, you know, over time, transnational ties might actually decline among children of transnational migrants. But fundamentally, the sum and substance is that the transnational optic allows us to accommodate a framework, allows us to acknowledge a framework, or even be inspired by a framework where migrants are simultaneously embedded in multiple sites. Typically, these could be, you know, in home and host societies, sending and receiving societies in different countries, and so on. So now what we're going to do is we're going to look at various ways in which transnationalism has been conceptualized in the literature, right? So a very popular definition by Bash et al. Is that transnationalism are the processes by which immigrants forge and sustain multi-stranded social relations that link together the societies at origin and destination, right? So typically you have multiple spaces, societies at origin and societies at destination, and we're talking of social relations, social networks which are tied together by immigrant, right? So that's again a very simple and powerful definition of transnationalism. And more recent scholarship understands transnational migration as taking place within fluid social spaces that are constantly reworked through migrants' simultaneous embeddedness in more than one society, right? And now these arenas could be multi-layered, multi-sited. They include not just the home and host countries, but also other sites around the world which connect migrants to their co-nationals, to their co-religionists, right? And so therefore what you have is, you have social spaces, social arenas where both migrants and non-migrants are there. So this is a fundamental point, right? Both migrants and non-migrants are affected by transnationalism, right? And this is because of something called social remittances. So Peggy Levitt has coined the term social remittances. Now, social remittances is a concept where ideas, norms, practices and identities, they flow. So you all are familiar with the concept of economic remittances, largely referring to financial or money that is sent from destination to host societies. But social remittances is something very, very fundamental. It's very powerful. It's the flow of ideas, norms, practices and identities. And so you can see, you don't really need to be a migrant per se to be a recipient of social remittance, right? And so she also argues that, Peggy Levitt also argues that within these spaces is so dense, thick, widespread that non-migrants' lives are also transformed even if they don't move, right? And this kind of talks to the whole literature on those left behind, right? People who don't move or cannot move, but they are really affected by migration and migration cultures and so on. So now let us come to the to some more ideas around transnationalism. So now there are the types of spaces that produce and that are produced by transnational migration, and that, you know, and examine the social structures embedded within them. So one is structuration, right? Now what do we mean by structuration? So just as we know that, you know, the individual's autonomy is influenced by structures, structures are also maintained and adapted through the exercise of individual agency, right? So therefore the interface at which an actor meets a structure is known as structuration. So the point being that migration can be conceptualized as structuration, and to capture the continuous dynamic between structure and agency that extends into transnational domains. Then we have a concept of migration circuits, right? There are circuits of migration, flow of and movement of people from one place to the other continuously in a particular path, in a fixed path. Those are circuits of migration, right? These could be common routes of migration, like, you know, like from India to the US, from India to the Middle East. Within India, we know from Kerala to Saudi Arabia, or from Andhra Pradesh and Telangana to California. So those are typically migration circuits, right? And then you have transnational social formations. That's another way of thinking about or conceptualizing transnationalism. Then you have transnational livelihoods. Livelihoods typically have an economic connotation where you're earning an income through a livelihood. And livelihoods largely can be understood at the level of the household. You can also have individual livelihoods. And then you have transnational life. Now, transnational life includes those practices and relationships that link migrants and their children with the home country, and where such practices have significant meaning and are regularly observed, right? Another way of looking at transnationalism is through the lens of topography. So Feist has given the conceptualization of transnational topographies, right? So what do we mean? There are, you can see the categories. So the first category is dispersion and assimilation. So according to Fraser, this is where you have weak and simultaneous embeddedness in sending and receiving countries, and therefore the ties are short-lived, right? This is the category of dispersion and assimilation. The second category is that of transnational exchange and reciprocity. Now, what happens in transnational exchange and reciprocity is that you have strong simultaneous embeddedness, but rather short-lived social ties. What about transnational networks? In transnational networks, you have weakly embeddedness, but you have long-lived ties, right? And then we come to transnational communities. Transnational communities are where you have strong embeddedness in at least two countries, right? Then there's also the concept of social fields by Peggy Levitt and Nina Glick-Schiller, and they argue that social fields are sets of multiple interlocking networks of social relationships through which ideas, practices, and resources are unequally exchanged, organized, and transformed. Let us now come to some more concepts in transnationalism. A very important idea is around modes of transformation within major domains in transnational migration. And this is given by Verteweg. Verteweg characterizes transnational migration as involving three modes of transformation. And you can see them on the slide. Within the major domains, right? So what he calls perceptual, this is in the socio-cultural domain, and conceptual is in the political domain, and it's then largely around the ideas of identities, orders, borders. Then you have institutional, which is in the economic domain, and this has to do with forms of financial transfer, public-private partnerships and relationships, and the development in the economic domain. Then we also have the concept of transnational from above versus transnational from below. Now, transnational from above can be typically thought of as global, capital, media, political institutions, all these, broad kind of macro structures and institutions. Whereas transnationalism from below can be more local, be related to grassroots activities, and so on. There's also a distinction made between narrow and broad transnationalism, right? So narrow transnationalism typically refers to highly institutionalized, continuous activities that involve regular travel and so on. Whereas broad transnationalism could be loosely coupled with sporadic or no movement, right? And then there's the concept of core transnationalism versus expanded transnationalism. This is introduced by Guarnizo, and Guarnizo defines core transnationalism as those activities that form an integral part of an individual's habitual life. And they are taken on a regular basis, and they are patterned, and therefore they are predictable. Whereas expanded transnationalism is something which includes migrants who engage occasionally. For example, you could be involved in situations related to political crisis or natural disasters in the homeland. So therefore, it's not something that you do very often, but it's still something that you do, right? And then other scholars have argued for a broader approach, right? A broader approach that could include both formal and informal, social, cultural, religious practices, and fundamentally then connecting all levels of social experience. Now, if we sort of take a slightly longer view of the matter, scholars have suggested that compared to earlier, present-day transnationalism has much greater diversification of both form and content, right? And now what do we mean by this? Present day transnationalism is far more important, it is argued, compared to forms of transnationalism earlier, and it can involve either single or multiple cross-border activities. It can be prompted by specific situations. It can be carried on by individuals, immigrant families, ethnic groups, communities. So you see how we are also looking at multiple units of analysis, from the individual to the household to the group or community. And then it can be through formal channels, through informal channels, right? And it can be confined to the public lives of the people or the private lives of the people on both sides of the border, right? So what Nina Glick Schiller does is that she differentiates between ways of being and ways of belonging. Now, by ways of being, she means that actual social relations and practices that individuals engage in, these are the ways of being. Versus ways of belonging are those practices that signal or enact an identity, demonstrating a conscious connection to a particular group. So therefore, you can think of transnationalism as ways of being versus ways of belonging, right? Now, many people have argued that transnational migration is not a new phenomena. It has existed historically, and you can look at it from the lens of immigration in the United States. In fact, the story of immigration in the United States can be told historically through the lens of transnationalism, right? Now, how is this? In the late 19th and early 20th century, many immigrants intended their sojourns to be temporary. They never immigrated to the US with the purpose of permanently migrating, right? And so much so that, 30 to 40% of immigrants went back to their homelands in the late 19th and early 20th century. And furthermore, migrants always sent a little something back for their household, right? Sent home back to their family. And these were not small amounts, right? So between 1900 and 1906, the total amount of money orders sent from immigrant colonies in America to Italy, Russia, and Austria-Hungary was a staggering $90 million. Then you also had migrants actively engaged in transnational processes of nation building and identity politics that influenced a wide range of countries. These countries were China, Italy, Greece, Korea, Hungary. So then the question arises that, if transnationalism has always existed, what is different? Why is it more important now? So there are 3 points to that answer. The first point is that many developing countries have become economically dependent on remittance migrants sent, and they have put in a huge number of policies and incentives to ensure that this migration continues, right? The second point is that although the US labor market warmly welcomes highly skilled, fluent English speakers, though even this is changing now, it is much less hospitable to poorly educated migrants with poor language skills. Now, these migrants are then pushed to transnational lifestyles. They cannot have, they largely move because they don't have a secure economic footing at home. And when they move to the United States, they're very different from those migrants, from those professional migrants who have the human capital, the cultural capital to take advantage of opportunities, right? So therefore, you have a big class divide in transnational livelihood strategies, where one class of migrants are economically very well off and they may not be precarious, whereas for others that might not be the case. And then finally, you have the intensification of international economic and labor markets, the globalization of media, time-space compression resulting from transport communication revolution, and all of this has made transnational migration for travel, for communication, quicker, easier, and more readily available. So therefore, though historically you can argue that, you know, transnational migration has been there, it's not a new phenomena, it's because of these three reasons that we just discussed. It's more important now, and this is also what's fundamentally different about it from earlier times. Now, coming to the question of generation. How do we conceptualize generation in transnational migration? So, now generation is really important in transnational migration, right? And not surprisingly, many scholars think that transnational practices, attachments are widespread among the first generation, but not so much so in subsequent generations. Now, why do they say this? The first thing is to do with declining language fluency, right? As you live in a certain destination over time, it's likely that your children and their children will not remember the home language, but be more comfortable in and practice everyday life in the language of the host state, right? And the other thing is that transnational children or generations, further generations, may not be interested in or may not have any intention to return to their ancestral home, right? Then if we conceptualize generation from a lineal process, you know, coming from one's lineage, what implications does this have for the transnational optic, right? So one of the main things is that it is not possible to separate migrants and non-migrants and social networks that exist for many migrants for second, third generation and so on, right? And therefore, a clear boundary between migrant and non-migrant is just simply not possible, right? And then at the same time, you may have some families that are more transactional, they take part in transactional activities a lot more than other families that don't, right? And clearly then transnational activities are not central to the lives of many in second or third generation and so on, while they at the same time they very frequently participate in transnational activities like their parents. So you have a situation where children might not be going back on a regular basis to their ancestral homes, but they are raised in households where people, values, goods and claims from somewhere are present on a daily basis, right? So think of Indian immigrants in the US, think of Korean immigrants in the US, even in the context of internal migration, you know, wherever you are at destination, whether you're Bengali, whether you're Punjabi, whether you're Malayali, a lot of these ethnic identities really play a big role in your everyday cultural practices, right? And then of course, you know, even if they do not practice transnationalism like their parents did, it's not that intense, but they can do if they choose to, right? Because they are a part of the same social networks and settings that are permeated by social remittances. So then fundamentally, you know, the idea of the generation is very, very important in transnational migration. There's a fair bit of research which has happened across the idea of generation. The other thing is that there are certain themes which are very, very significant, right? And there are three that we've listed here. One is the durability of national or state borders. So now you see, while transnationalism means that you are simultaneously embedded in multiple societies, there is some understanding of blurring of boundaries and so on and so forth. But however, the durability of nation state borders is very, very strong, right? And of course, there are variations in state economic, military and political power between host destinations and home destinations, between origin societies and destination societies. And along this, then you have a continuing rhetoric of national loyalty. So transnational lives, transnational people, transnational families are constantly navigating multiple identities, multiple nationalities, and within all of this, the state is very, very important, the nation state is very, very important, And depending on whether the idea of dual citizenship is there, or depending on their ties with the home state and the destination state, there's no escaping the nation state, right? And that kind of is very, very evident in transnational migration research. So therefore, scholars argue that the links between the citizen and the state are multiple, and rather than disappearing, they are not disappearing, right? And what states do is that states reconfigure themselves, dropping some functions and assuming new ones. So very recently, there was a change in the US about the policies relating to H-1B visas, right? Now, this has fundamental implications on transnationalism, the ability of people to be embedded in multiple societies simultaneously. So, you see, states are also constantly changing, constantly refiguring themselves and changing their rules, their laws and ideas and so on. And then, of course, you know, migrants' ability to make political claims is a function of what the state allows them to do, right? So, if you have the dropping of certain visa kinds, if citizenship tests change, then migrants' ability to make claims, to make political claims on the state also change, right? So, fundamentally then, you know, we see that migrants' ability to make political claims is a function of what the state offers them, right? And since states are also constantly reconfiguring themselves, which is, you can see that as sort of, you know, structural constraints or possibilities and so on, eventually migrants' abilities to make political claims depend on the state. So now let us come to transnational migration by domain. So I'm briefly going to introduce these ideas to you in this slide, and then we will continue in the next class. Right. So let's look at it. Let's look at it one by one. First, the discipline of economics, right, or the domain of economics. Now, economics is largely concerned with in the transnational space with globalization, and within globalization you have a context of late capitalism and crisis, which is there in transnationalism, right? So, and so this is a somewhat negative discourse, but the positive discourse comes from the side of the remittance literature, right? So there's a whole literature on migration and remittances, where remittances are seen as the new development mantra, they're seen as the panacea for development, and the sheer number, the sheer amount of foreign exchange that comes in from developed countries to developing countries through international migration is staggering, and economics is very concerned with that. So what are the impact of remittances in local communities, source communities and so on, right? Like for instance, in India, $135 billion was received as international remittances last year, right? So that's a huge amount. Then you also have a sub-regional context in economics, right, where you have transnational labor flows, transnational capital flows, and how is it that, you know, a little bit more about what these flows might be, their categorization, their impact, their economic differentiation. That is also a part of the economic literature on transnationalism. Then there's a very distinct literature on ethnic entrepreneurship, right? This literature talks about how is it that specific ethnicities have certain kinds of businesses, right? So like you would have heard of Patels in the US owning motels, right? Similarly, in the UK, you have many restaurants that are owned by Indians. So how does the idea of ethnic entrepreneurship work? And one of it is through social networks. Through transnational social networks, migrants are able to access labor, are able to access capital and carry on with entrepreneurship. So that's also something that's there in economics. In politics, let us come to politics now, right? In politics, you have transnational practices. There is a focus on transnational practices. These could be politics of the homeland, immigrant politics, translocal politics. That's one categorization that we're going to do. The other thing that we'll see is that even though, we spoke about how nation states are increasingly becoming stronger, they are here to stay, and political borders are hard, but there's also a growing overlap between political identity and legal statuses. This is also something we'll do. Then you have the idea of various kinds of transnational citizenships. We will cover this. And then you have, Saskia Sassen's work on various kinds of transnational migrants, those who are authorized but not recognized. And so they could be legal citizens of another country, but they could face discrimination and so on, ghettoization. On the other hand, you could have unauthorized migrants, right? They might be undocumented, but they fully take part in political, social, economic life. So unauthorized yet recognized. So typically, these are some of the concepts we're going to look at in the domain of politics in transnational migration. And largely, we will also discuss again a little bit more about how navigating in transnational space has strengthened rather than negated the continuous significance of the national. So nation states continue to be very important in transnational migration. Then we'll move on to the social, in the broad arena of the social and the broad domain of the social. We're concerned about social change, we're concerned about social dynamics. So we'll look at the transformation in kinship and family structures, and specifically looking at class, gender, race, power structures. Then the other area where we'll go to is the transnational moral economy of the kin. Then we'll also look at life course, just the way we looked at generation. And then we'll focus on experiences of parents, children, elderly, how these might differ. And then we're going to look at the idea of circulation of the children and elderly, and then transnational adoption. And within this, we'll talk a little bit about gender and racial hierarchies. Now last, coming to the cultural domain, we're going to focus on globalization, the nation and culture. That's going to be one theme. Then we're going to look at borderlands as transnational units. We're going to discuss the idea of transculturation. Transculturation very simply refers to the transformation that occurs when foreign material enters a new social context. We'll talk about migration melange, referring to the mixed and hybrid spaces and times. And then we'll also talk very briefly about the cultural transformations tied to the politics of citizenship and belonging. So this is broadly what we'll cover in the next class. And along with this, we'll also look at the methodological implications of using a transnational optic. And then we'll be done with our section on transnationalism in migration studies. So thank you very much. Bye-bye.